Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today on our very first Carbon Solutions webinar. We're going to go ahead and get started now. I'm really excited that you're all here. I'm going to hand it over to Grace, who's going to introduce our speaker. But before I do that, I just want to touch base on a few points of housekeeping. First, this webinar is being recorded, and this will be added to our YouTube channel after the webinar is over for people to view later. And then throughout the webinar, please use the chat feature to ask any questions. And then once the presentation is over, I'll be able to moderate that Q&A session. And then third, if you're interested in joining any of our future webinars, please feel free to subscribe to our newsletter on our website. And there'll be more announcements for future webinars there. We're going to have one webinar every month. And so with that, I thank you all again for attending, and I'll hand it over to Grace, who will announce our speaker.
Hi, everybody. I am Grace Selman, and I'm the Marketing and Communications Associate at Carbon Solutions. We are super excited to welcome you to our first webinar and introduce you to our first speaker, Richard Middleton. He is our Carbon Solutions CEO. Prior to co-funding Carbon Solutions 2 years ago, Richard spent 15 years at Los Alamos National Laboratory and Oak Ridge National Laboratory. He has won 4 R&D awards, a Power Award finalist in 2020, and has been ranked in the world's top 10 most cited CCS researchers, being number 3 in the United States and number 1 in the DOE system. He received multiple awards at Los Alamos, including number 1 first author in Earth and Environmental Sciences, most impactful paper in computational earth science, and a distinguished Los Alamos Mentor Award. He'll be speaking today on a recent GHGT conference paper that investigated pathways to decarbonizing the U.S. electricity system with CCS. And now I'm going to hand it off to Richard.
Thank you for the introduction, Grace. Welcome, everybody. We're really happy to be starting the seminar series that we're kicking off and joining every month for the next ones that are coming along. Today, I'm going to be talking about, as Grace said, a project that we've just wrapped up, talking about reaching zero, ways to understand how the existing electricity system can get to net zero with a focus on fossil fuel plants that will still be operating in 2030. And just like Grace said, this is a presentation that we gave at the GHGT conference in October in Lyon, with a couple of extra little slides in there to show some progress. So very quickly, for those that don't know, a quick background on Carbon Solutions, the small business that I co-founded a couple of years ago. We started with 2 of us a couple of years ago. We had 5 people this time last year. We are now up to 28 employees. We have about a dozen PhDs. We've had about 50 projects. We focus on research, consulting, and software. About 60% of our budget currently is from the federal government, DOE, and NSF. About 25% is with nonprofits, and about 15% directly with industry. On the right-hand side, you can see some of the kind of services that we offer as a company, though today we're really going to be focusing on more the data analytics and particularly the SimCCS tool set. And we can also see the other applications, energy applications that we focus on. CO2 capture and storage, CCS, is our primary focus of the company, but we do a whole range of things. Direct air capture, we just landed a new direct air capture project from DOE a couple of days ago. We do geothermal and wind and energy storage, grid modeling, electric vehicles, energy equity, a whole range of things, but CCS is our most prominent research area. So why are we doing this project? Really what we were very interested at, and I've been interested in my whole career, is the scale of CCS, the scale of CO2 capture and storage. Where do we have to get to? And if you start looking at studies like the Princeton Net Zero America team who we work with, I have this one on the screen, or the Low Carbon Regional Initiative between GTI Energy and EPRI. If you look at these studies that are coming out, we need to be looking at billion-ton or more each year storage, transport, storage, capture of CO2. That's where we're going, and this is going to be a massive, massive infrastructure challenge. And so for the US, this idea of gigaton scale, or gigaton one, as I like to call it, how do we get to the first gigaton one? What's that infrastructure going to look like across the US? Across the world. This is going to be many gigatons. This is going to be a scale up of 1 or 2 orders of magnitude, 10, 100 times from where we are today. How are we going to do that? That's what this question is that we're going to answer, and we're going to focus on the electricity system first in this study. So I have the map up from the Princeton Net Zero America study. You can see kind of the scale of pipelines that they're looking at. You know, tens of thousands of kilometers of pipelines that would be needed. But really, the 3 things that I'm going to focus on, 3 or 4 in green on the right, is how I'd wrap up this talk. We really want to focus on how are we going to do this? Can we focus on the synergies of the CCS system? Can we look at the gaps that we need to fill to be able to get to this challenge? The concept I'm really focused on right now is carbon deserts. Where are the areas in the US where we need to be capturing CO2, but it's really difficult because there aren't any existing storage opportunities? And then the final theme, big thing for what I'm going to talk about, is the idea of distributed versus centralized storage. Centralized storage being more like hubs, distributed storage being storage all across the US, and how this comes up with 2 very, very different answers to what CCS might look like. So again, we're looking at what would a carbon-free electricity system look like in the US by 2035, and that includes all of the power plants, the fossil plants, the coal and the gas that are still slated to be running in 2030. What can we do about that? We have another study I'll mention at the end that's focused on all CO2 sources in the US, but this study I'm going to talk about today is just focusing on the coal and gas plants. So really, we're looking at what is the scale of carbon-free power going to look like? Is this reasonable with CCS? And so that's what this project would look at. And we had to develop some new databases and tools to look at this. But what we ended up with, we identified 429 coal and gas plants with over a gigaton of CO2 that could be captured. And these are plants, again, that currently are still slated to be open in 2030. And we're going to start to look at what would that CCS system look like, both distributed and centralized storage. So this is the underlying thesis of what we're going to be looking at today. First, though, how do we do this? Anybody that's known about my career, knows a little bit about Carbon Solutions, will know about the SimCCS software toolset, but I'm going to spend a few slides talking about it, where we're at, and what SimCCS does. SimCCS basically is a decision support tool to help you understand where, when, and how to capture, transport, and store CO2, and it does it simultaneously. These decisions, the capture, transport, and storage, are dependent on each other. It simultaneously understands those at the same time. There is an optimization engine at the center of SimCCS, but it doesn't tell you the optimal solution. This is all about decision support. And I'll very quickly talk through the tools that we have to support that, to capture, the transport, and the storage tool. And you'll see those on the right-hand side called CONCORD, CUSMAP, and Scott. And we just show the soccer ball figure to show how these tools, the capture, transport, and storage tools, feed in to help SimCCS. So many people will have seen this slide before, and I'm not sure if the animation showing is looking a little funny on my screen, but this is showing the kind of things that you can do with SimCCS. This is a study we did with Southern Company about 10 years ago, looking at their coal plants, trying to understand what would happen if they had to manage their CO2 emissions. Southern Company's not looking at their coal plants right now, but they are looking at natural gas plants, so we're helping with them right now. So what you're seeing is these red circles are places to capture CO2. These are the coal plants. The blue circles are places to store CO2. These are the subsurface sinks. And you can see the green lines that are appearing on the screen. That's where SimCCS is deploying these pipelines, saying this is where you should put the pipelines. And again, it's doing the capture, the transport, the storage, at the same time giving you this geospatial infrastructure. And then the bottom is supposed to show the economics and other details that you can pull out of SimCCS. And here we're going from the smallest carbon capture target we did was 5 million tons a year, stepping through to over 100 million tons a year to show this is what the CCS infrastructure could look like in this region. And you'll see the paper at the bottom that we published on this about 10 years ago. So very quickly want to step over the capture, the transport, and the storage tools that we have First of all is the capture tool that we have called CONCORD, where we're bringing all the best available data on CO2 emissions. We have proprietary algorithms that convert that CO2 emissions into streams of catchable CO2. We have proprietary economics that we attach to that. But we come up with what we think is the best database for understanding capture opportunities across the US. And that's what we're showing here, this map of CONCORD. And this is a project funded by the NSF. And so for each source, we're able to understand how many streams of CO2 there are, what is the capture, what is the CO2 stream concentration, what is the cost, and we're even getting into now understanding what are the co-benefits of capturing CO2, what else happens apart from reducing CO2 emissions. So that's what CONCORD is. That's what's going to feed some CCS in terms of the source data, the capture data. The second tool that we bring in is called CostMap, and again, you'll see the publications here in the past that we've done on CostMap. And this is, we would argue, the best tool for routing pipelines. It brings in a nonlinear fashion a range of geographies. It brings in, oh, there was a question in there. Is everybody seeing the slides? Somebody saying they were only seeing, I don't know if anybody else has that. Okay, I think people are saying they do see the slides. I don't know the best way to fix it. Okay, I'm going to call it good and we'll keep moving on and we could address this. Anyway, so CostMap, the best tool we think for routing pipelines. It brings in all these layers of geographies. It brings in population and topography, land ownership, land use. It brings in rights of way, such as pipelines and transmission lines. It brings in barriers like rivers. And it brings all this data together and you're able to build multi-scale cost surfaces. In theory, as low as 10 meters. Normally, we go down to 30 or 90 meters, and we're able to route pipelines. We're able to say things like, give me the lowest cost pipeline route. Give me the pipeline route that that avoids schools, or it minimizes river crossings. So you can put that information in there, and then that's what you'll get out in terms of the pipeline route. And this is what's going to help us. This is what's going to help us build those potential corridors for the pipeline. So I guess it's just a chat. I guess since I'm talking, somebody suggests if it's not working, you can try and sync to presenter. And if there's issues, I can try swapping. Just let me know maybe in the background what's working. So if this continues to be issues, just let me know in the chat and we'll see if we can fix it. So we've done the capture, we've done the transport. Now we're looking at the storage piece, and we have a model called SCOT. And again, you'll see the publication at the bottom. And this tool there's two components to it. The first is a tool for understanding how you dynamically inject and store CO2 and attach a cost to that. And the second part is a database that we've been building, a geologic sequestration database across the US. And when you combine these two together, that's what you get, this map in front of us, the SCOT storage capacity map. So these blue circles are places, this is just, I should say, saline storage only. The size of these blue circles is proportional to the storage capacity that SCOT is estimating. And if I flip to the next slide, you'll start to see, we also have the economics. You can start to see the cost of storing CO2 across the US. And so the idea is, when you bring together the capture, the transport, and the storage, you can feed that into some CCS, and we start to be able to get a question to understand what commercial scale CCS might look like across the US. So we're going to run through these power plant scenarios. There's one set for distributed storage, one for hub storage. And so we'll go through these fairly quickly. First of all, just going back again to what the scenario is. This is the distributed storage. We're looking at the 429 coal and gas plants. We have 136 coal, 293 natural gas, just over a gigaton of CO2 available, 1,044 megatons. And you can see the black circles are the coal plants and the red are the natural gas plants. And underneath, we're showing where the SCOT storage is. Each of these sinks is going to be a potential place to store CO2. And the SimCCS model is going to minimize the cost of meeting a certain CO2 capture target and storing all of that CO2 and building the pipelines. And I'm going to quickly run through several scenarios where we'll look at 2, 4, 6, 800, 1,000 megatons, and then capturing all the CO2 to understand what it would look like if we built a CCS system to manage all of that CO2. The first thing we need to do, we talked about cost map. It builds potential corridors to build pipelines. That's what we're looking at here. You've got the CO2 sinks from Scott in blue, the sources in red, and you've got some gray lines in the background. These are potential places to build the pipelines, and some CCS is going to use those to understand where it should build the pipelines. So the first scenario, as I said, we're going to go 2, 4, 6, 800,000 megatons through to a gigaton. The first one is 200 million tons a year, and I'll step through these fairly quickly. But you'll see on the left-hand side, it will tell you how many sources we're capturing from, how many sinks we used. It would look at the pipeline network, and then it has the costs broken out by capture, transport, and storage, and the total CCS cost. So when we started 200 million tons a year, we have 43 sources, 32 sinks, a couple of thousand kilometers of pipeline. And then you see the capture, transport, storage, and total costs of 68, couple of dollars a ton, $9 a ton for storage, and just under $80 a ton total. And as we step through, you'll see those costs change. And because it's an economic minimization problem, you'll start to see the total cost will go up. As we capture more and more CO2, we have to use more expensive transport often, and more expensive sinks, and more expensive sources. So this is for the 200 million tons a year. 400 million tons a year on the right-hand side, you start to see the pipeline network, the green, get larger and larger. The red dots appearing in the ones, the coal and gas plants it's using to capture CO2, and the blue circles is where the storage is. So 600, 800, we're up to 1,000 million tons a year. And I'll just pause on the gigaton. This is what it looks like for all of the CO2 capturable in our database, just over that gigaton. This is what the pipeline network could possibly look like, and all the sources and sinks that are being used. And a couple of things you'll notice if I put on the laser pointer, you'll start to see areas like Appalachia has a lot of potential to capture CO2, the Northeast and the Atlantic seaboard, but they don't have good storage options. So you'll start to see some big pipeline networks appearing. And the same again, once you're into Arizona, we know there are places to store CO2 in Arizona, but it has not been well characterized. So you'll start to see big pipeline networks in the West seeking out places to store the CO2. So this is what the distributed storage looked like. We had those hundreds of sinks, thousands of sinks available from Scott, and we let the model pick any of them to see what it would look like. And what we want to compare it with is the hub scenarios, the centralized storage. And the way we do this is, instead of looking across the whole country at all the possible Scott sinks, we want to focus on different hubs. And the way we did this, we worked with the people that put the Great Plains Institute Atlas, the Carbon and Hydrogen Storage Atlas together, and we looked at the dozen or so sinks that they had, or the 14 hubs. And then we said, in those hubs, you can use the Scott storage, but outside of that, you can't. So we wanted to look at how does this change if we just used hubs. And so it's going to be the same again, like we did before, except we have the hub. So here we're just showing, here's some CCS in the background, here's the hub areas that we can use, and then we break them down by their cost and the size of those hubs. So these are the only places now we let the model store CO2 in the hubs, and we're going to see what the difference is. And so we do the same thing again. We step through 246, 800, 1,000 million tons a year, then a gigaton. And you start to see some differences. And at the end, I will show you the differences with pipeline networks and costs. So 200 million tons a year, 400, 600, 800. There's the gigaton, and then there's all of the CO2. And what you start to see is one of the differences. Oh, let me go back to that one. You start to see, because now we don't have distributed storage, we don't have storage anywhere over the US. We start to see you're gonna, if you limit it to just these hubs, the model's going to say you need much longer pipeline networks. Now in the Southeast, there's no storage in Florida, there's no hub there, so the CO2 has to be piped out. In this case, all of the hubs apart from one is used. The hub in Appalachia, because the geology is not great, it was always so expensive that hub never deployed, and instead it has these giant pipelines moving hundreds of millions of tons of CO2 from Appalachia and the Northeast and even the Atlantic seaboard over to the closest low-cost hub, which is the Mount Simon in Illinois and Indiana. And again, this is just to show if you go with just the hubs, this is kind of what you might see. So going to the last couple of slides, and again, we're going to share these slides afterwards, so you can see the GHGT paper online as well, just to show an example of comparing the distributed storage with the centralized storage. So we have the distributed storage on top, centralized below, and what you start to see is there is a difference in costs And it kind of varies for the scenario that you're looking at. And typically when you go through the transportation costs, a lot of scenarios are higher for the centralized scenario because you've only got these limited hubs. You have to pipe the CO2 further, but it can balance that out by seeking out lower cost storage options. So I won't go over all the details, but you can start to see the pipeline length. So for example, the distributed scenarios, to capture all the CO2, we needed 32,500 kilometers of pipeline. For the centralized one, we needed almost 8,000 kilometers more of pipelines. And that's just, again, because there aren't sinks all over the country. You now have to pipeline the CO2 to the nearest hub. Anyway, in your own time, you can look at the difference between the two. And it just to show it's really important when we think about storage, there's different ways of doing this, the centralized versus the distributed. One slide I wanted to show before I wrap up on the last slide is that the study that I'm talking about today was just for the 430 or so coal and gas plants that will still be operating potentially in 2030, and what it would look like if we had to manage those emissions. We have another study right now that's just starting to wrap up that was a follow-on study. It didn't look at any of the electricity really. It looked at just industrial CO2 sources, and to show what would happen with those. And so there's a whole range of facilities, and this study would look at ammonia and hydrogen, ethanol. You can see the list up there, ethylene, pulp and paper, a whole range of things. And we said, okay, what happens if we just look at those, forget about the electricity plants, the power generation, what would it look like? And so you can see here, this is a case just capturing just over 530 million tons a year. Now we're looking at a massive, not just 400 sources, we're talking almost 3,000 sources, 2,700 sources we're looking at across the whole country. We're looking at 329 separate sinks from Scott. And now, before for the electricity only, we were looking at about 40,000 kilometers of pipelines at most. Now we're looking at 62,000 kilometers of pipeline. And so I don't have too much more to say on this other than we've done the electricity, we're writing up that report, and we're wrapping up this other study where we can look at all, because we have the CONCORD database, we can look at all CO2 sources and we can run some CCS for it. And a couple of things I'd point out before I get to the last slide is it's a little bit different than people are used to looking at. If you remember the Princeton Net Zero America slide at the beginning, if you go and look at some of the Great Plains Institute work that I helped them with some CCS, often they had it with the pipelines kind of draining down into the Permian. That's what a lot of these studies have done. But what we find now with the power study and with the industrial CO2 store study, we don't really find that. There's lots of storage in the Midwest, for example. That's where we see a lot going. We don't see many pipelines going down to the Permian at all. We see some coming down into Oklahoma. But anyway, this is what we think a more realistic look at what massive scale CCS might look like in the US. We've done it for power, we've done it for the industrial sources. So just to wrap up on the last slide, kind of the take-home message. On the left, I just put a different visualization of what you just saw with the industrial sources. So the take-home message, the why, the how, the what. Why did we do this? The motivation. We really wanted to understand CCS at scale. We want to understand it for research purposes. We also want to understand it, for example, if the EPA puts a rule out saying fossil power must manage their CO2 emissions as part of getting to their carbon pollution-free power by 2035. If that rule came out, what would it look like? What does that task look like? That's what this study was all about. Giving that information, coming up with the costs, the extent of the infrastructure. The how, of course, is the SimCCS toolset that I've been working and building for years, and now we have at Carbon Solutions. And kind of the what were we able to get at this? And so just a few things I mentioned at the beginning that I said I would come back to. One of them was definitely there's a big difference between centralized and distributed storage. We need to understand that. That's kind of what this study got. The gaps and synergies was talking about, how can we, different sources leverage each other to build the networks? Where are the gaps in this? So these kinds of tools help us understand how we get to that challenge. And the last thing I wanted to talk about, and I used the term a couple of times, is the idea of carbon deserts. Again, it's areas here I'll highlight on this map. You're talking about the Atlantic seaboard, Appalachia, and a few other areas in the country. They have hundreds of millions of tons of CO2 available potentially, but they either have no storage, such as onshore Atlantic seaboard, or the geology is just not great like Appalachia. These are what we're starting to call carbon deserts, areas where we know we have to manage the carbon, but there's no good way to do it. So that concept of carbon deserts is really coming out. And then one of the follow-ons, not in this study, we've started to build offshore storage databases for the North and the South Atlantic and the Gulf offshore. And so, in a few months' time, we'll be able to come back and say, how does this picture change once you put in offshore storage? So anyway, the last thing I would say, that the real motivation behind this is we know we need to get to gigaton level CCS, what I call gigaton 1. We know we need to get there, and we have to get there by 2050. We have to get there sooner than that. How are we going to do it? And this is all about that. The motivation is building a roadmap to help us to get that. So I will leave it there. Thank you for everybody joining. And then let's move on to some questions.
Excellent. Well, we do have 3 questions so far, and if anyone in the audience is listening to this and has more questions, feel free to add them to the chat. The first question, Richard, was just, does the model include existing CO2 pipelines?
So it's a really good question. So it includes existing rights of way by default. So it includes those routes, but it does not include available capacity in existing pipelines. And it doesn't include things like maybe repurposing a natural gas pipeline to CO2, which we know is possible. So it doesn't currently do that. But I can say in the next 3 to 6 months, we have proposals out there and some other things that are definitely going to add this capability, again, using any existing capacity in the pipeline and repurposing. Now, you can actually set some CCS up. It's a little awkward. You can set it up to say there is some existing capacity between 2 locations. So the answer is yes, you can do that, but it's kind of awkward and doesn't give you the most visual response. But we're working on that, and we'll get there soon.
Great. The next question is, are these tools available for use?
Of course, another great question. So things have changed. When I was in the national lab system, I spent a number of years at Los Alamos. We pushed everything into not just open source, into the public domain. We did that because we wanted to share it and we wanted anybody able to use it. And for me, that was good because we were able to base the company on this. What I would say is now, because the company's based on it, they're proprietary. We don't license them, but we work with anybody and everybody who wants to work with these tools. And we have a range of clients that work with us. For research purposes, yes, we like working with students that want to publish with this and use these tools. And we've done that on multiple occasions. And so for education, we will work with you just to work this freely. Other than that, we do a lot of work with nonprofits, but we basically do it as consulting. I guess I would say, even though my goal when I was at Los Alamos was to push everything out to the public, what we really found out was when you work with clients that are doing these kinds of studies, they really want the experts to be working with it. And so that's why we've gone to this. We don't have a licensing model, it's a consulting model. We found out that's really the best way to get the use out of these tools. But for education purposes, reach out to us. We'd love to hear from you.
And then a couple more questions coming in. First one, this is kind of in the weeds, Richard. It's a question regarding cost map. If you have a time-dependent study where the cost surface could change over time, can you account for that uncertainty? And if not, how sensitive is the surface to that uncertainty?
Okay, so this is a great question. Nobody's asked this one before, so it's always good to get some new questions. So there's a temporal version of some CCS where it will deploy the infrastructure over time. It's much harder to solve, but we use it, and it's a good way to say, hey, we're going to build this infrastructure over 30 years. Give me how it would expand out over time. So we have that and we do that. But I've never actually thought about doing it where you change the cost surface as you go along. So in theory, it's possible because you can just build as many of the underlying cost surfaces as you want, and you could change the cost of transportation in each time period. I've actually just never thought of doing that, so it's possible. In terms of the sensitivity and the uncertainties, um, it's interesting. So there are sensitivities, of course. If you tell it, hey, don't cross any rivers that have a flow faster than 100 cubic feet a second, you're going to get a different answer than if you said do whatever you'd like, because it will just route, through the water, around the top of the watershed of these rivers. So for things like that, it's really sensitive. For other things, where the whole surface adjusts at the same time, it's really sometimes not that sensitive. You might get a different route and it might change the cost, but it doesn't change it that much because everything kind of changed at the same time. So if you put something in, I don't know the best way to put this, but if you put something in that's very kind of discrete or Boolean that changes things, such as you cannot cross rivers, or you have to be a kilometer away from school, something like that will probably be pretty sensitive. But other things in general, when we've changed costs, we've changed the weights of land use and ownership and other things, it doesn't change the route that much because it impacts everywhere roughly at the same time.
Excellent. And then the last question in the chat right now is a follow-up to the existing pipeline question, which was, would existing pipelines affect the results that you shared today significantly, or would you expect it not to have much of effect?
Yeah, this is a good question. It's more than a guess. My intuition says it won't actually have that much of an impact because quite a few of the CO2 pipelines are relatively full. And so it's not as though there is that much existing capacity. And often where there is, people have plans to fill it up. So in terms of existing pipelines having availability, I'm going to say it's actually not going to have that big of an effect. And if you'd asked me a couple of years ago, my answer would have been slightly different. But today, I think it's going to be the existing capacity will be saturated. In terms of repurposing pipelines, it's interesting. Some people will repurpose pipelines. So Tallgrass bought the Trailblazer pipeline, a natural gas pipeline that took natural gas, I think, from southeast Wyoming as far as Nebraska. They bought that pipeline and they're repurposing it. They're changing the flow and they're going to send CO2 from Nebraska to southeast Wyoming and store it out somewhere there. But a couple of things, there was a DOE workshop the last couple of days that I was at. For my opinion, a couple of things on repurposing. The first is, you can repurpose pipelines. Denbury did it in the southeast quite a while ago. They took the flow, they reversed the flow, and they have it as dense phase liquid CO2 in it. But it's a 50-mile pipeline, and they were able to do that. In general, for long distances, it becomes hard to repurpose a natural gas pipeline. Natural gas pipelines are only rated up to 1,600 psi. CO2 pipelines are typically, let's say 2,500 psi. And it's kind of going into the weeds, but you have to keep CO2 in the dense phase. So you're going to keep it between 1,200 and 2,500 normally, a CO2 pipeline. If you're in a natural gas pipeline, you've got to keep it between 1,200 and 1,600. So for long distance, you have to start adding pumps in and you get other issues. And so the cost skyrockets. In the case of Tallgrass, their way around this is they have the pipeline, they're going to run it as gas phase. And so they don't need to add particularly more pumps. There's some other things they need to do. But if you go in gas phase instead of in their pipeline, I can't remember, maybe it's a 36-inch pipeline. If it was a 36-inch CO2 pipeline, you could get in something like 50 million tons a year. In gas phase, you can only get 10 million tons a year, or give or take. I don't know the exact numbers. So really, that was a long way getting up to the repurposing. It's expensive. And then the flip side, talking with people, not just expensive, but with the hydrogen economy, you're actually going to get more natural gas moving around. So there probably aren't going to be too many more pipelines necessarily available with the hydrogen economy. So existing CO2 pipelines, mostly at capacity, not all of them. You have like from Sheep Mountain, Bravo Dome, there is some capacity, but mostly existing CO2 pipelines, not too much capacity. Repurposing existing pipelines because of the age and the pressures, I don't think it's going to happen that much. And so, honestly, I think you are going to start seeing a lot of new pipelines to get here. And the beauty of something like cost map is you really want to focus, in my opinion, on existing rights of way, just because some of the work's already been done. Somebody's disturbed the land. You're probably not going to put new river crossings in necessarily. Sticking to existing corridors is probably the way to go here. And you can do that with cost map. You can tell some CCS only use existing rights of way, and the model will do that for you.
Excellent. Yeah, we have one more question related to that just came in, which is, can CCS be adapted to hydrogen?
Yes, now I see who the question's from. I'm only laughing because midnight tonight is the deadline for putting in a proposal where we are going to convert some CCS to hydrogen. So the answer is yes. We have another proposal with a partner that's about to get funded that's doing it. So the answer is yes, we're doing hydrogen pipelines. The complex thing for hydrogen is, particularly with blue hydrogen, is you can have CO2 pipelines and hydrogen pipelines, and that's what this proposal is getting at. And the idea is you're going to use some CCS to understand where you might fuel or feedstock switch to hydrogen or build a new facility. And the question is, are you going to want to transport the hydrogen away or the CO2 away? Some CCS is going to tell you what that balance is. And even though I think it's really important to convert some CCS to, in this case, MH2, I think what you're going to find is it's usually going to be cheaper and easier to transport the CO2 than the hydrogen. And so you probably always want to be producing the hydrogen if you can, where you're using it, and shipping the CO2 out if you have to. But yes, that's what we're working on. It's been done 10, 12 years ago. A colleague of ours, Niels Johnson, while he's doing his PhD, took some CCS and started using it for hydrogen. So it's been done before. There's just a much more sophisticated way that it needs to be done, and we're just starting to do that now.
Okay, excellent. Well, that's all the questions in the chat this time. I want to thank everybody for attending. And as a reminder, this will be put up on our YouTube page, and we'll probably just email all attendees with that link as a follow-up afterwards. So with that, if you have any final remarks, Richard, but thank you again for attending.
Oh, thank you very much for everybody coming along. Reach out anytime with questions.